Well, hello everyone. Les, thank you very much for your introduction. I'm really very pleased to be speaking here today on the occasion of the honouring of Professor John Legge. Professor, as a practitioner, I take my hat off to you. I've certainly valued your work on the countries I've served in, including obviously Indonesia and Papua New Guinea and Fiji, as well as valuing your work on the editorial advisory board of the Department of Foreign Affairs. I think that the output of that work, I think, has been really very important for people like me. One other introductory point, in the interests of self-preservation, I need to say, possibly with tongue-in-cheek, that Gareth Evans's period as Foreign Minister was characterised by all of the positive tendencies I'll talk about and by none of the negatives. Now, I think it's really important to recognise that both Australia and Indonesia will hold elections in the next 18 months, and it's really standing the usual historical experience on its head to say that the outcome in Australia has or possibly had seemed to be emerging pretty clearly in recent months, while no one yet can have any real certainty about what might happen in Indonesia. I think it's certainly a plus that, as Zara said, Mr. Abbott has said that if he becomes Prime Minister, his first overseas visit would be to Indonesia. That would be certainly appreciated by Indonesians, who in like manner appreciated the fact that John Howard got on a plane within days of the tsunami in 2004, who likewise appreciated the fact that Kevin Rudd visited Indonesia within days of being elected in 2007. Quite apart from gestures, though, let's reflect a bit on the realities of the Indonesia that any Australian government will be dealing with in coming years. Clearly, Indonesia going into 2014 is a vastly different country from the country that was battered by the Asian financial crisis in 1997 and experienced the overthrow of President Suharto amid violence and killing in 1998. 15 years on, the country is looked at by many as a resurgent Asian giant in the Indian or the Chinese mould. And it's certainly true that Indonesia moved through the global financial crisis quite comfortably on the back of its large population and the fact that its economy is not really heavily trade exposed. Indonesia, it's had high growth rate in recent years, steady inflation, strong foreign investment growth, and a variety of observers look to Indonesia and say this is a country that will be the world's 10th economy or possibly the world's 7th economy within coming decades. I think it's whether you accept that or not, there's no doubt that this is an economy that we will increasingly have to take note of. Our government's recent white paper on the Asian century certainly and rightly includes Indonesia among the handful of Australia's most important relationships. And former Prime Minister Keating went further, declaring Indonesia the most important country for Australia's future. I think both sides of politics in Australia seem to be showing their appreciation of the need to understand the many complexities in this country of 240 million people, a country with many different religious, ethnic, linguistic, regional backgrounds, a country that we must understand. Certainly, that understanding is more complicated than it would have been under Suharto. In the 9 years since the first direct presidential elections, Indonesians have really embraced democracy. They turn out in large numbers to vote in literally hundreds of elections each year, regional, national, local. And they show quite a frequent keenness to oust the incumbents. And I think that recognition of Indonesia's democracy is important. Indonesia's got a vigorous, highly opinionated media, public opinion polls, rallies, demonstrations, and active civil society. President Yudhoyono has overseen, I think, a serious period of consolidation of democracy. He ended the separatist movement in Aceh. he's basically impressed as a moderate and constructive participant in global financial and political fora. Yet corruption remains endemic, together with nepotism and money politics. And while Yudhoyono has taken some positive steps against corruption, many Indonesians are dissatisfied with with his record, dissatisfied with his irresolution on issues like corruption and intolerance towards religious minorities. And I've certainly encountered many Indonesians who hark back positively to the days of authoritarian rule, which among other things delivered for very, very many poor Indonesians stability of food prices. Now, against this background, almost 10 years of Yudhoyono, he can't run again. There's a huge preoccupation with prospects for next year's presidential and congressional elections. That's already seen some erosion of effective leadership, jockeying for a political advantage, to the detriment of good government. And there's clearly an obsession, this might sound familiar to us in Australia, an obsession with the question who might enter the presidential race. Some potential candidates, I think it's important for us to realise, are very far from being reform-minded. So it will not be not necessarily be a person who looks like, acts like Yudhoyono. So here it is on our doorstep, the world's fourth largest country, the world's largest Muslim population, the world's third largest democracy, a country of enormous strategic importance to Australia, a looming economic power. I mean, no wonder it gets our attention. But the bigger question, though, is really how we can continue to get Indonesia's attention as its horizons broaden in step with its growing self-confidence and economic power. Perceptions, I think, are important. And it's really not positive that as we approach that task, how do we get Indonesia's attention in coming years? It's not positive that many Australians still think of Indonesia as a military threat or as a country with an authoritarian military government. It's not positive that some Indonesians think of Australia as a threat, as a country determined to dismember or humiliate Indonesia. Now, I think many Australians, many in this room, many Indonesians, government and non-government, have worked to change perceptions over time, and I applaud that work. I'm frankly an optimist about our capacity, our joint capacity to change perceptions. And I do believe that we've together developed a pretty good modus operandi for working together as democracies. Now, inevitably, that's a more complicated and messy environment than the one we knew when Suharto's word trumped all others in Indonesia, when if we got him on side, everything else fell into line. That is not the case now. But the great advantage now is that at our best, we're able to make allowances on both sides for the other's political imperatives, or indeed the work of cartoonists. You know, a cartoon against Suharto is no longer a crisis, against Yudhoyono is no longer a crisis in our bilateral relationship in the way that it was when we had Suharto pictured as an ape in the Australian in 1996 or something like that. But realistically, there are some dynamics which, against the background of some positive developments, make for less positive developments. Some Australians seem to forget that Indonesia has a free press, and it's certainly not helpful that the Indonesian press will report what Australians say about boat people, live cattle exports, Papua, or foreigners taking Australian jobs. But that's what the Indonesian press is there for. It's a free press. And so the real unhelpfulness is in our forgetting that Indonesia operates in that way now. On the Indonesian side, there are elements like protectionist trade policies, corruption, legal uncertainty, irregular business practices, which directly affect Australian views of Indonesia as a place to do business. And of course, there are sensitivities about issues like Papua, or jailing Indonesian miners, what appear to be confiscatory actions against Australian mining investments, actions which adversely affect Australian agricultural producers. I think that all of those we have to understand and accept and work through. We also need to bear in mind that in some areas our two countries have found it difficult to move relations to a level which would seem commensurate with the size of our two economies and our proximity. Trade and investment is an underdone area. The figures don't reflect the size of the relationship we might expect. I think it's a very good thing that our two governments have agreed to negotiate a closer economic partnership agreement. It's a very good thing that the business councils have made very constructive submissions to governments on the potential content of that agreement. And it's certainly a good thing that governments will face up to the need to look at issues like protectionism, legal uncertainties, and from the Indonesian perspective, people movement issues which affect our two-way trade and investment. I think it's very important that we see the private sector taking up opportunities in Indonesia. Because after all, identifying opportunities is one thing, acting on them is another. And if governments can create a better working environment, that will encourage the private sector. But for the present, that economic relationship is undercooked. The same is true of our people-to-people links, and many people here will understand the dynamics there. Those links suffered during the past 15 years as a result of the Asian economic crisis, and since 2002, Australians' very understandable concerns about terrorist attacks in Indonesia. As many know, we've seen a huge falling away of Indonesian language studies in Australia, partly in response to perceptions of Indonesia's economic prospects, as well of course as funding cuts for language studies generally. Now, I think there are bright spots in terms of the way we're dealing with each other on personal levels. Many thousands of Indonesians studying here. We've had, in recent years, new twinning arrangements between Indonesian and Australian schools. We've long had exchange visits which continue between Muslim leaders, journalists and editors. We've developed a new defence alumni network, which I think is a really significant development in this past year. And in Australia, both the government and the opposition have developed ideas for growing the relationship, for example, through a reverse Colombo plan. But these ideas will clearly require persistence, attitudinal changes and money. Now, it may be that Indonesia's looming growth may be a spur for an attitude change, but for the present anyway, this area of people-to-people links, like the economic area, is undercooked. I think more encouragingly, we can point to substantial developments in our bilateral relations over the past 20 years. Now, it might be that, like Wagner's music, our relations during that period have been characterised by wonderful moments, but terrible quarters of an hour. Lots of us here have lived through some of those terrible quarters of an hour. Yet, at the highest political levels, we've seen an evolution in thinking about how we should interact. I think we've had very good relations over this past 20 years, notwithstanding some of the real difficulties that we've seen, for example, following the independence of East Timor. We now have annual leaders' meetings, annual meetings of defence and foreign ministers. The sort of patterns that we have in our dealings with traditional partners like New Zealand or the US or the UK, although I would say that the feel of these encounters is not yet of similar quality, and we still see, I think, a tendency to be preoccupied with difficulties and issues that need to be addressed. Notwithstanding that, I do believe it's important that we recognise that Australia and Indonesia have demonstrated that we both see advantage in working together in our region and internationally. Indonesia, for its own reasons, strongly supported Australian membership of the East Asia Summit and the Asia-Europe meeting. We've co-hosted regional processes on issues like illegal fishing, counter-terrorism, disaster preparedness and irregular people movement. We've taken joint initiatives in the G20 and APEC, for example, on climate change. Both countries approach these issues from their different national perspectives, yet each of us has concluded that working together and being seen to work together suits our own interests. I personally think it's very significant that Indonesia feels positive about being seen to work with Australia on these issues. Bilaterally, I think we have worked successfully to develop our security relations following that bruising period in relation to East Timor. The Lombok Treaty on Security Cooperation, in my view, has proved to be a scene changer in the security sphere of a sort we've not yet seen in the economic or the people-to-people spheres. In practice, it's provided a platform for the further development of our bilateral defence relationship, as well as providing a formal basis, much valued by Indonesia, for developing our dealings in areas like fighting crime, counter-terrorism, transport safety and security, customs, and fisheries. It also, of course, contains a treaty-level commitment not to support separatism. And I believe, on the basis of experience, that undertaking is valued by Indonesia. Now, some Australian commentators are sceptical about the genuineness of Australia's undertaking as it relates to Papua. But I believe that we need to understand that this is an existential issue for Indonesia, and that our government must continue to honour our commitment, notwithstanding opinions about Papua and human rights that quite rightly will make it into the discourse within Australia. And I believe that we should honour that commitment, because the bottom line is it's in Australia's interest as well. I'd like now to talk briefly about three particular areas where our two countries have interacted and to draw some lessons from them. First, the good. Australia and Indonesia share a strong interest in countering terrorism. Indonesia has on the whole a tolerant society, but it's also had experience of terrorist acts, and as we know to our sorrow, those acts have killed many Indonesians and Australians. Australian and Indonesian dealings to combat terrorism have been, in my view, first class. We've promoted successful regional cooperation, including through establishing the Jakarta Centre for Law Enforcement Cooperation. The Australian Federal Police and the Indonesian National Police have worked together with a scrupulous regard for national sensitivities, prerogatives and sovereignty, and much of their work together has importantly been conducted out of the glare of publicity. The results have been impressive in terms of arrests of terrorists, disruption of terrorist plans. Second issue, the mixed. In relation to people smuggling, both countries have been adversely affected over the past 15 years. Indonesia by a variety of social and economic problems caused by transient populations, and of course they're concerned also about the imprisonment of many of its nationals in Australia. In some respects, we have seen effective cooperation, including our joint sponsorship of the Bali regional process, and bilaterally the work of Indonesian police in breaking up numbers of people smuggling ventures on land in Indonesia. But we've also seen negatives, including the corrupt involvement of some Indonesian government personnel in facilitating people smuggling. Certainly, we have experience of the limits to the cooperation we can expect. The Indonesians, understandably, have generally not been willing to deal with boats once they've left Indonesian ports en route to Australia. And there's been a range of public opinion in both countries, some of it unhelpful, reflecting national interests, media handling, and in some cases, ignorance. We've seen regional governments in Indonesia vociferously protesting against central government moves to detain asylum seekers in their backyard. NIMBYism exists in Indonesia. And among Australians, we've seen expressions of views by a variety of people about turning back the boats, cutting off aid, or making the boats issue the real test of the relationship. As diplomats might put it, not all of this has been best suited to encouraging deeper cooperation. Third issue, the downright ugly. In 2011, with the flimsiest fig leaf of consultation, our government announced the suspension of the live cattle trade to Indonesia. This ill-conceived decision adversely affected Australian trading interests and the livelihood of thousands of Australian families. It undermined Australia's claims to be a reliable food supply for the huge Indonesian populace. It played into the hands of elements in Indonesia hostile to our commercial interests, and it caused political difficulties for the Indonesian government. I think 10 out of 10 is a case study in how not to deal with Indonesia. Now, I draw some lessons for the future from these examples. In doing so, while our starting point should be to encourage positive trends, it's important to bear in mind that we cannot take for granted a continuing benign environment. There are areas where some recent positive trends may come under stress, or where there will be need to be sensitive management of contentious issues. The results of the 2014 presidential elections will be a test for Australia. We'll almost certainly not see so outward-looking or reform-minded a president as President Yudhoyono these past 9 years. There's no guarantee about the trajectories of a new administration. Yet we'll inevitably have to deal with the next democratically elected president of Indonesia, no matter what some Australians might think of him or her. And by the way, the Indonesians will inevitably have to deal with the democratically elected leader of Australia, no matter what some Indonesians might think about him or her. So our relationship with Indonesia, it's a huge understatement to say, will never be one we can set and forget. Australia will need to work at it and inevitably work harder than Indonesia, because getting it right will increasingly matter more to us than to them. So as we enter our mutual election year, I offer the following thoughts for any Australian government. First of all, we should recognise the facts of life in Indonesia. Increasingly democratic, though that can't be taken for granted, a looming major economic power, and a country likely to become more assertive regionally and internationally. Among other things, this requires that we treat Indonesia with respect and throw away our megaphones. We should understand that Indonesia has its own interests, its own perspectives, which we can harness to our mutual advantage if we handle things in the right way. In saying that, I think we should also be confident about the real strengths that Australia brings to the relationship, and bear in mind also the ways that we've demonstrated that we can work well with Indonesia, and the clear signs that Indonesia values what we do together. We should clearly continue to encourage development of trends in both countries towards proactive development of our security, economic and people-to-people links. And I think we should be, above all, active and inventive in pursuit of Australian interests, remembering that our relationship with Indonesia should not be seen just as a series of transactions, problems, issues to be sorted out. Senator Carr said rightly recently, no one issue should be allowed to seem more important to us than the totality of the relationship. And just as this is the case in our dealings with countries like New Zealand or Japan or Britain or the US, there will inevitably be issues where Australia and Indonesia will disagree. We should deal with those issues in the context of a broad and robust relationship. We should, above all, value the totality of the relationship and work constructively and intelligently to advance our interests within that context. We have some remarkable instances where the two countries have dealt with each other in just that way. There are others where our public discourse shows all the signs of a narrow focus on issues which concern us, and an inadequate attention to how we can deal maturely and effectively with Indonesia on issues perceived, presented and handled as affecting us both. That's the way to get things done. The people smuggling issue is one where we've shown we can make progress based on the interests and perspectives of both countries. It's also an issue where Indonesians have from time to time found Australia to be importunistic and shrill. Now I'll conclude by referring to words from two Indonesians. On 29 March 1934, writing from prison in Cipinang, Sultan Syahrir wrote, I do not have any right to assert, and in such cases there appears to support your morale only the famed Oriental trilogy: modesty, resignation, and patience. Now, 70 years on, I would not associate resignation with resurgent democratic Indonesia. And modesty, together with courtesy, is being joined by a growing self-belief and self-confidence in Indonesia's international dealings. The third element, patience, will, I think, become less instinctive as Indonesia grows in stature and self-confidence, and will be increasingly tested in an environment where both our countries are dealing with all the messiness, all the clamour of democratic processes and pressures. The second Indonesian I quote has had plenty of experience of those pressures and clamours. Former Foreign Minister Hassan Wiroyuda, when questioned during one rough patch with Australia, acknowledged Indonesia's occasional difficulties with its southern neighbour, but added by way of perspective that, quote, Indonesia has a perfect relationship with Iceland. Thank you for your attention.